Hello, and welcome to Grand Dukes of the West, Episode 55, Spheres of Influence. Last time we explored the Burgundian envelopment of Luxembourg, which pitted Philip the Good against the new King of Germany, Frederick III. But while Frederick was keen to preserve the rights of his ward Ladislas, the hereditary Duke of Luxembourg, he did not intend on maintaining the generally hostile relationship that his predecessor Sigismund had with Burgundy. We saw how early on in his reign, Frederick met with Philip on two occasions to discuss both the Burgundian designs on Luxembourg and imperial recognition of Philip's other acquisitions. And even though the King of Germany was firmly opposed to the former, he was willing to accept the latter. Still, little ever materialized from these talks, and I stand by my description of the relationship between Frederick and Philip as pleasantly non-committal. Throughout the 1440s, the King of Germany and Duke of Burgundy would often open negotiations on a variety of topics. A marriage alliance here, imperial recognition there, the granting of some imperial prerogatives to Philip, the settling of old debts, and maybe some Burgundian intervention against the Swiss. None of it went anywhere, but these talks were notable due to the fact that they simply showed that Frederick and Philip were on good terms, if nothing else. So when I bring up an imperial proposition from the mid-1440s to give a crown to Philip the Good, don't get too excited, as that also goes nowhere. But even so, it does give us an interesting framework to explore the Duke of Burgundy's relationship with the Empire. The original proposal was a fairly modest one, that either Frisia or Brabant be elevated into a kingdom. Never mind the fact that the Duke of Burgundy wasn't really in possession of Frisia. Philip took this proposal and ran with it. Not only should this kingdom include all of Philip's imperial territories, but it should also include the duchies of Guelders, Julich-Berg, Cleves, Bar, and Lorraine, and the counties of Mark, Moors, and Vaudemont, as well as numerous other Low German and Low Country lordships as its fiefs, and that it should be exempted from homage to the empire. In effect, it would be a revival of the old Frankish Kingdom of Lotharingia. Now, unsurprisingly, Frederick III was not prepared to make this massive grant, and the negotiations stalled. So why should we care about this proposal, then? For one, the fact that Philip was thought to be worthy of a crown is a good indication of his prestige. But what I find particularly interesting is the fact that Philip clearly just outlined what he saw his sphere of influence as. So let's go through the list and explore Burgundy's relationships with those imperial neighbors. We'll start off by covering the Duchy of Cleves. Cleves was probably the imperial polity most within the Burgundian orbit, and you might remember that Cleves was first brought into that orbit back in 1406 when Adolph of Cleves married Marie of Burgundy, a daughter of John the Fearless and a sister of Philip the Good. This connection would only grow stronger over the years as several of Adolph and Marie's children were raised at the Burgundian court. The couple's two sons, John and Adolph, would both become fixtures of the court. Both drew generous pensions from the Duke of Burgundy, and both would be made Knights of the Golden Fleece in the 1450s. John would succeed to Cleves in 1448, and while he would still consistently visit the Burgundian court, he did have other things to worry about. Adolph of Cleves, on the other hand, who I'm also going to call the Lord of Ravenstein to avoid confusing him with his father, would truly find his place at the Burgundian court, and will become a major player as our story continues. As Philip had no legitimate daughters, his nieces from Cleves would often be used to seal alliances with other princes, as was the custom of the time. We've already seen how two of Adolph and Marie's daughters were married off to the Dukes of Orléans and Guelders, and matches would also be made with a number of German princes, as well as the King of Navarre. These marriages were, for the most part, all arranged and paid for by the Duke of Burgundy, and primarily served to expand his diplomatic ties. Philip would also use marriage to reinforce the ties between him and his Clevish nephews. John of Cleves would be married to Elizabeth of Nevers, the daughter of Philip's cousin, John of Nevers, the Count of Étampes, and Adolph of Ravenstein would be married to one of Isabella of Portugal's nieces, and later to one of Philip's own illegitimate daughters. By all accounts, Philip the Good was quite close with his Clevish family, and in fact, some of the few truly personal letters which survive from the Duke are between him and John of Cleves. And here we get to see the Duke in a light which no other sources can really paint him in. Quote, "My Lord Sharpwits, I commend myself to your very bowels, and am ready to pout like a pigeon with the rest of them, and otherwise do nothing, and for good reason. Since I wrote you, I have no further news. I beg you, tell me about the fair lady, all that can be put into writing, and about your doings, if such is your pleasure, fine sir. The Ghenters still have as much love for me as for the devil, and are as amiable as they want to be. Farewell, Turd, you shall have no more, for I am going to see if I can pull myself up after your fashion, you know how, or whether I've lost the knack. Hi-ho!" Now, some of the finer points of this letter may have been lost in translation, but Philip's affection for his nephew is still clear. The close alliance between Cleves and Burgundy served both parties well. Burgundy gained an important ally in a key region of interest, while Cleves gained financial, political, and diplomatic backing from Burgundy. These close ties between Cleves and Burgundy also raised the status of the ducal family, and Philip's marriage policy opened doors for the daughters of Cleves that might have otherwise been closed. Apart from Burgundy, Cleves' other defining relationship in this period was its on-again, off-again conflict with the Archbishopric of Cologne. But before we get into that, we need to talk about the county of Moers. Moers was a small county on the Lower Rhine, surrounded by the duchies of Cleves and Berg, the county of Mark, and the archbishoprics of Münster and Cologne. According to the Dukes of Cleves, Moers was a fief of Cleves, but the Counts of Moers would argue otherwise. Still though, hostility between the ruling families of Cleves and Moers was not necessarily a given, and peace was partly assured by the marriage of Count Freidrich of Moers to one of Adolph of Cleves' sisters. Freidrich of Moers was a firm ally of the Duke of Burgundy. In addition to being a brother-in-law of Philip, he was a Knight of the Golden Fleece, and he undertook a number of diplomatic missions on behalf of Burgundy. While Freidrich was the oldest son of Moers, he was not the most ambitious, and it was his younger brother, Dietrich, that I want to focus on now. Dietrich of Moers, described by Pope Pius II as, quote, easily the foremost German of his time, was brought up by his uncle, the Archbishop of Cologne, and when that uncle died, Dietrich was duly elected in his place. In addition to Cologne, Dietrich also managed to scoop up the bishopric of Paderborn and arranged for his brother Heinrich to become the Bishop of Münster. And as the Archbishop of Cologne, Dietrich of Moers also claimed the title Duke of Westphalia, and he sought to increase his influence throughout the region to turn the mostly honorific title into a practical one. One of Dietrich's principal rivals in this was Duke Adolph of Cleves, which by extension pitted him against the Duke of Burgundy. Even though Friedrich's pro-Burgundian outlook would not really extend to his brothers, I would not necessarily call Dietrich of Moers anti-Burgundian, even if I will certainly assert that he was anti-Cleves. The first bone of contention between Cleves and Cologne was the County of Mark. Mark had been held in a personal union with Cleves for a little while now, but Adolph's father had decided to split his lands between his two oldest sons, Adolph and another Dietrich. When Dietrich of Mark died, both Adolph and another brother, Gerhard, claimed his county. The Bishop of Cologne, looking to stifle the power of the Duke of Cleves, lent his support to Gerhard, and in return, Dietrich of Moors gained some lands which a previous bishop of Cologne had ceded to Mark. Moreover, there was some talk of making Mark into a fief of Cologne, but that wouldn't end up panning out. When everything shook out, the county of Mark was divided between the brothers, with Adolph remaining the Count of Mark, while Gerhard, despite controlling the bigger half, was to refer to himself as Count of the Mark, and he agreed to make his nephew, John of Cleves, his heir. So maybe Mark would not be cleft from Cleves totally, but the Archbishop of Cologne still gained from the conflict. And this struggle on his borders was really just a distraction from Dietrich's true passion to extend his power in Westphalia, which centered on his attempts to regularize and expand his rights of taxation in the region. This in turn brought him into conflict with the towns of Westphalia, and in particular with Soest, the leading town of the duchy. Eventually, the Archbishop of Cologne was able to get all the towns of Westphalia back on his side, except for Soest. And things between the Archbishop and the town only grew worse until the city seceded from the electorate of Cologne and placed itself under the protection of the Duke of Cleves in 1444. This ignited what is known as the Soest feud, and over the next few years, Cleves and Cologne fought over Soest as well as a handful of other towns and lordships. Both sides built up alliances, and on a few occasions it looked like the feud might spill out into a general regional conflict. Charles VII of France and Emperor Frederick III lent their support to Dietrich of Moors, as did William of Saxony, Philip's rival for Luxembourg, his brother, the Elector of Saxony, and the Duke of Brunswick. On the other side, Philip naturally backed his brother-in-law, and he was even able to convince Pope Eugenius to depose Dietrich from the See of Cologne, even if nothing came of this, and the Pope would back down soon after. Gerhard, Count of the Mark, chose to support his brother, who he had reconciled with a few years earlier, rather than his former ally. And the Duke of Cleves also found support in many of the other cities of Westphalia. In an interesting turn of events, Rudolf von Diepholz, the Bishop of Utrecht, despite the fact that he was no Burgundian ally, chose to support Philip and Adolph, as another of Dietrich's brothers, Walraven, was presently trying to take over the Diocese of Utrecht, which I touched on back in episode 45. The feud was generally dominated by sporadic and limited fighting, but the largest effort did see William of Saxony gather an army of over 10,000 Hussite mercenaries in the summer of 1447. William's plan was to conquer Soest for Dietrich and then continue on to take Luxembourg for himself. When Philip heard of these plans, he made preparations of his own to defend Luxembourg and Soest, but in the end his aid was not needed. John of Cleves led a valiant defense of the town, and together with the Soest militia, he was able to see off William of Saxony and his Hussite army without any Burgundian aid. After William's expedition came to naught, both sides seemed to have lost their energy. Some more fighting would flare up here and there, but really both Cleves and Cologne now decided that the issue should be solved at the negotiating table. John of Cleves, now the Duke, technically won the feud and ended up with control of Soest and the town of Xanten, but Dietrich of Moors did not walk away empty-handed, as he had managed to conquer some territory in Mark. But even though John and Dietrich had just made peace over Soest, they then almost immediately found themselves on opposite sides of the Münster diocesan feud. This feud, which broke out after the death of Dietrich's brother Heinrich, the Bishop of Münster, saw another of Dietrich's brothers, the aforementioned Walraven, along with Rudolf von Diepholz's nephew Conrad, and Eric of Hoya, the scion of another regional noble family, all vie for Heinrich's recently vacated bishopric of Münster. John of Cleves and his uncle Philip the Good backed Eric of Hoya, and as Eric seemed to be on the cusp of victory, the Moors and Diepholz factions united against him. From here, the feud would go back and forth for years, and would eventually end with the exhaustion of all parties involved, and the Pope appointing yet another candidate to the diocese. While the Münster diocesan feud was not an astonishing Burgundian victory, it does demonstrate how Burgundian influence continued to penetrate further into the empire. I don't want to overstate Philip's participation here, as he mostly provided diplomatic and political support to John of Cleves and Eric of Hoya, but the Duke of Burgundy certainly was an interested party, and his backing did provide Eric with both papal and urban support at critical junctures, even if it wasn't enough to secure the bishopric for him in the end. Although Burgundy and Cologne found themselves on opposite sides of the Soest and Münster feuds, they were not necessarily enemies so much as rivals. Philip and Dietrich always had diplomatic channels open, and Dietrich's brother Freidrich was a Knight of the Golden Fleece after all. And while Cleves and Cologne went to war with each other on numerous occasions, Philip himself never did declare war on the bishop. In addition to the good relationship between the Duke of Burgundy and Count of Moors, Philip also paid pensions to a number of Dietrich's counselors and advisors to engender their goodwill. And in fact, he did this with the other two electoral archbishoprics, Mainz and Trier, as well. So although the archbishop-electors were all wary of Burgundian expansion towards the Rhine, and would oppose that expansion on occasion, none of them would do so rigorously, and none would be outright enemies of Burgundy. And with all this talk of bishoprics, you might expect me to now delve into the bishoprics of Liège and Utrecht, but I really don't have all that much more to add from when I last mentioned them in episode 45, and what I do have I think I'll leave to the 1450s, as that's when things really heat up over there. So now, let's move on to Guelders. Like its neighbor Cleves, Guelders was a moderately sized duchy right on the borders of Burgundy, and as the Dukes of Cleves also held on to the county of Mark, the Dukes of Guelders also ruled the county of Zutphen, which I won't bring up again, sorry to all the Zutphen enthusiasts. While Cleves had fully embraced its position within the Burgundian sphere of influence, Guelders was much more indecisive, and the reign of Duke Arnold of Egmond would see a series of steps both forward and back in terms of its Burgundianization. After the old Duke of Guelders died in 1422, Arnold of Egmond was invited by the estates of the duchy to succeed his distant cousin, while Emperor Sigismund promoted the claim of Duke Adolph of Julich-Berg. This forced Adolph to court the support of the Duke of Burgundy, who was happy to grant it, and Philip would further draw Arnold into the Burgundian sphere by arranging for the young duke to marry Catherine of Cleves. Burgundian influence would continue to grow as Arnold, Catherine, and the couple's children would all spend a good amount of time at the Burgundian court, and moreover, Philip helped to negotiate a settlement between Arnold and Adolph of Julich-Berg in 1436. But unlike Adolph of Cleves and his sons, Arnold of Egmond faced the prospect of Burgundian domination with some wariness. The Duke of Guelders wished to remain on good terms with his powerful neighbor, but he did not see his interests as closely aligned with Burgundy as Cleves did. Still though, in the first half of his reign, this would not be much of an issue, and it's really only in the later 1440s that Arnold starts to act against his uncle-in-law's interests, such as when he opposed Eric of Hoya in the Münster diocesan feud. This in turn would cause tensions with his thoroughly pro-Burgundian wife, as well as his son, Adolph, who took his mother's side. Now, this was not the only cause of tensions in Guelders. Arnold's troubles had more to do with his increasingly dire debt spiral than anything else, and Adolph's defiance was just as much based in dissatisfaction with his father's rule as it was dynastic. To that end, Adolph was able to cultivate support in the estates of Guelders, who were particularly opposed to Arnold's practice of pawning off his lands for cash. Philip would once again put himself forward as a mediator to settle this dispute, and in 1448 he did manage to reconcile father and son. But watch this space as these tensions will continue to build. Arnold's debts are growing worse by the day, while the estates of Guelders remain unwilling to grant additional taxation to their duke. But with those troubles for Guelders still ahead, let's take a second to visit Julich-Berg. Burgundian influence on the duchies of Jülich and Berg was certainly felt, even if it was a bit less direct than in Cleves or even Guelders. Despite Philip's support for Arnold of Egmond in the Guelders succession, Adolph of Julich-Berg and Philip the Good had a pretty solid relationship, and the two dukes would sign a number of deals and treaties over the years. Upon Adolph's death, Arnold of Egmond decided to flip the script and claim Jülich for himself, while Adolph's nephew Gerhard decided to revive the family claim to Guelders. Gerhard would win a decisive victory against Arnold at the Battle of St. Hubert's Day, and while this victory would not end up granting him control over Guelders, he did secure Jülich and would found an order of chivalry, the Order of St. Hubert, modeled on the Order of the Golden Fleece, to commemorate it. While peace between the duchies was soon re-established, Gerhard would maintain his claim to Guelders, so again, file that away for a future episode. And now, despite the fact that this is an episode all about the Holy Roman Empire, I'm going to talk about French politics. Now don't worry, the territories I want to talk about, Bar, Lorraine, Vaudemont, Alsace, Montbéliard, and Metz, are all in the Empire, even if they're also now a part of modern-day France. So, to refresh your memories, Rene of Anjou, the Duke of Bar, was married to Isabella of Lorraine, and the couple took over Lorraine when Isabella's father died. This takeover was not uncontested, as Isabella's cousin, Antoine, the Count of Vaudemont, wanted Lorraine for himself and declared that the duchy could not pass to a woman. Philip the Good, not wanting to see Angevin power grow between his two blocks of territories, backed Antoine's cause, and in 1431, Rene of Anjou was captured at the Battle of Boulneville. For the next several years, Rene would be held in Burgundian captivity, but finally in 1437 a ransom agreement was reached and Rene was released. As a part of this deal, Antoine de Vaudemont agreed to give up his claim to Lorraine, and his son Ferry was engaged to Rene's daughter Yolande. However, the peace was Burgundy's rather than Vaudemont's, and Antoine would quickly grow disenchanted with the deal, and was back to making trouble for Isabella and Rene before long. Now, the King of France intervened, and he was able to force a deal between the princes where Antoine de Vaudemont would give up his ambitions on Lorraine, for real this time, and Rene accepted that the County of Vaudemont would be independent from Lorraine. Charles VII then took the echo-shores which both sides had been employing, and redeployed them against the English, where they made up the core of an army set to besiege the key fortress of Meaux. From here on out, Antoine de Vaudemont would make no more trouble for Lorraine, and in 1445, Ferry de Vaudemont and Yolande of Anjou were finally married, which sealed the peace between the families. Antoine's disdain for Rene did not rub off on his son, as Ferry proved to be a loyal and reliable agent of his father-in-law. The wedding between Ferry and Yolande gave Rene of Anjou the perfect stage on which to demonstrate his magnificence. The wedding celebrations included a grand tournament of the kind which Rene would become known for, and a number of processions and ceremonies. Both King Charles and Rene would take part in the tournament, and both jousted under the arms of kings of Jerusalem, Charles VII with the Lusignans, and Rene with those of Godfrey of Bouillon. Heribert Müller posits, quote, "The way in which Charles VII and Rene of Anjou presented themselves at Nancy as kings of Jerusalem could be considered as a warning to Philip the Good not to put himself at the head of a crusade as a sovereign prince." Philip had been advocating for a crusade for a while now, and we'll have more to delve into his crusading ambitions in a future episode. But even if this particular joust was not a direct message to the Duke of Burgundy, the wedding and the wider events surrounding it certainly were. In the months leading up to the wedding, not only was Rene of Anjou holding court in Nancy, the capital of Lorraine, but Charles VII was as well, which meant that the King of France, and a French army, was sitting ominously between the Low Countries and the two Burgundies. To set the stage, a truce had been agreed to between England and France in May of 1444, which meant that now Charles VII could refocus his attentions, and that there were now many unemployed accoucheurs who needed something to do so that they would not turn to raiding. Moreover, the Truce of Tours was sealed with a marriage between Henry VI of England and Margaret of Anjou, another of Rene's daughters. This meant that Charles VII owed Rene a favor, and Rene was to cash in that favor to gain the king's help in his conquest of Metz. The bishopric of Metz, along with the nearby bishoprics of Toul and Verdun, all had nebulous relationships to the Duchy of Lorraine. Think Burgundy and the bishoprics of Liège and Utrecht. But while Toul and Verdun tended to hew a more deferential line, tensions between Metz and Lorraine had been bubbling up for years and had now reached a breaking point. There were a few reasons for this. Bandits from Metz had seized some belongings of the Duchess Isabella earlier that year, and raiders had also hit a nearby abbey which Rene had under his protection. Moreover, there were issues of contested debts, overlapping rights, and competing claims, and it seemed that the Duke of Burgundy had been getting some subtle support to the city, although I will admit I'm not sure of the extent. So Charles VII and Rene of Anjou marched into the region and reasserted Rene's authority over a number of towns before besieging Metz itself. But I should note that the actual running of the campaign was left to Pierre de Breze, Charles's latest favorite. Metz held out for 5 months before surrendering, but the fairly gentle terms of its surrender indicate that Charles did not secure a victory so much as he was paid off. The king was to be paid 200,000 écus, and Metz swore not to aid the king's enemies, but that was about it. Metz also swore to respect the rights and revenues that Rene held in the bishopric, but no mention was made of Metz actually submitting to the Duke of Lorraine, and Rene would keep complaining about Metz for years to come. While Charles was holding court in Lorraine, his son, Dauphin Louis, was also campaigning in the western reaches of the empire. Here, the Dauphin was responding to a request for aid from Emperor Frederick III and his cousin Sigismund of Tyrol, as the Habsburgs' on-again, off-again fight against the Swiss was now back on. The Swiss were besieging Zurich, one of the few remaining Habsburg allies in the region, and the emperor and his cousin were powerless to stop them. The King of France had been allies with the Habsburgs for a while now, and now that his resources were freed up, he was happy to help out. Not to mention that it was always a good idea to keep the mercenaries occupied whenever the fighting stopped, and this seemed as good an opportunity as any to give the accoucheurs something to do. And more importantly, something out of the way to do. The English thought so too, which meant that in the coming campaign we actually see the Dauphin of France leading soldiers who had been employed on both sides of the 100 Years' War. The Dauphin assembled his army in Champagne, and so the journey into Alsace and the still ill-defined Swiss lands meant a march through the county of Burgundy, complete with all the devastation that the mercenaries always brought with them. Once through the county, the Dauphin captured and occupied the town of Montbayard on its borders, which gave the accoucheurs a nice little base to raid the Franche-Comté from. Louis's first target was the town of Basel, and on the way he was met by a small Swiss force guarding the approach. The outcome of the ensuing Battle of Saint-Jacob an der Birs was never in doubt, as the Dauphin's accoucheurs outnumbered the Swiss by more than 10-1, and the Swiss were cut down to the man. Still though, in the process they managed to inflict significantly more casualties against Louis's force, and the Dauphin came away from the battle with a deep appreciation of Swiss military might. After this defeat, the Swiss called off their siege of Zurich in order to better defend against the Dauphin's army, which meant that technically Louis's initial objective had been achieved. Moreover, once the campaign actually got going, and the Dauphin's imperial allies got a taste of what help from the accoucheurs entailed, their attitude transitioned from, "Thank goodness you're here," to, "Thanks for all the help, here's the door." Louis then retreated into Upper Alsace and opened negotiations with the Swiss, while his men marched throughout the region, spreading both devastation and French influence. Over the course of the month, 15 cantons and towns were occupied, and it seemed that Alsace would soon be the domain of the Dauphin and of the Echoshore. The Prince of the Cutthroats, as Paul Murray Kendall terms Louis in this period, was then summoned to Lorraine by his father, and left his army to winter in Alsace. The ravages of the Echoshores continued, and the question on everyone's mind was, where would they go next? Italy was floated, either to secure the Duchy of Milan for the Duke of Orleans, or the Kingdom of Naples for Rene of Anjou. Maybe the Truce of Tours would not hold, and the soldiers would be needed back in France. Maybe the Dauphin would resume his attempts to take over Alsace. Maybe the next target would be Burgundy. In the end, none of these plans would be implemented, and the Echoshores vacated Alsace in early 1445. The core of Louis's army would reconvene in Montbayard, while the rest dispersed back to where they had come from. The problem of the Echoshores in France had been dealt with for the winter of 1444-1445 by exporting their violence elsewhere. But the fix was temporary, and a long-term solution was still needed. Now, despite the fact that the French expeditions in Alsace and Lorraine really did not end up accomplishing all that much militarily, they were quite successful politically. French influence was certainly pushed eastwards, and the princes of the empire took notice. Around this time, King Charles entered into alliances with a number of West German princes, such as the archbishops of Trier and Cologne, Jakob von Zirk and Dietrich of Moors, William of Saxony, the Elector Palatine of the Rhine, and Frederick III. These alliances were all directed either explicitly or implicitly against the Duke of Burgundy. The recent Burgundian annexation of Luxembourg was fresh on everyone's minds, and plans to reverse that annexation were certainly in the works. By campaigning in Alsace and Lorraine, not only was French military might demonstrated to those West German princes, but so was French interest in the region. Meanwhile, the Duke of Burgundy was powerless to stop this encroachment into an area which he clearly saw as within his sphere of influence. And the Dauphin's soldiers, now based in Montbayard, would be an ulcer in the side of the County of Burgundy. But still, the Duke of Burgundy had allies of his own in the empire, and again, we should not overstate the hostility of Trier and Cologne towards the Duke, or that of the Habsburgs. Burgundy was certainly a power in the empire, and Philip's imperial allies and friendly enough relations with other imperial princes were an important part of that power. There is much truth to Richard Vaughn's assertion that Philip the Good was the leading imperial prince of his day, and where Burgundy led, others would follow. Philip's proposal for a revived Lotharingia did not come out of nowhere, and while the Duke of Burgundy's influence over some parts of his proposed kingdom were more theoretical than actual, especially with respect to Bar and Lorraine, the idea that Cleves and Mark, Guelders and Zutphen, Jülich and Berg, Moors, and the other lands in the lower Rhine region could become fiefs of a Burgundian kingdom was not ridiculous. It's clear that the Duke of Burgundy saw his future opportunities coming from the empire. But he was not alone in looking to grow his power there. As the 100 Years' War comes to a close, French energies will be redirected eastwards, and Charles VII will be able to more effectively curtail Burgundian ambitions. So next time, we're going to return to France to explore the Truce of Tours, the king's military reforms, and the continually troubled Franco-Burgundian relationship. Thank you so much to my patrons: Christine, Duchesse de Nemours, Elliot, Graf von Ravenstein, Anthony, Comte de Châteauneuf-en-Auxois, Preston, Comte de Saint-Fargeau, Mark, Comte de Merceau, Diana, Graf von Beersel, Mehmet, Comte Santerre, Chris, Comte de Semur, Rosa, Comte de Germol, Elliot, Comte de Bussy-le-Grand, Eric, Comte de Couche, David, Graf von Barland, Jonathan, Comte de Bazoches, Olivier, Comte d'Ussert, John, Graf von Helmont, Spencer, Graf von Breda, Craig, Graf von Hoensbroek, Lexi, Comte de Blancmont, Sam, Graf von Mormont, and to my Knights of the Duchy. If you want to join them, you can at patreon.com/Valois-Burgundy. If you want to support the podcast in other ways, you can do so by leaving a review on your podcast app of choice and telling your friends about the show. Both really help to grow the show and will earn you my everlasting appreciation. If you want to keep up with the show, you can follow me at Valois-Burgundy on Blue Sky. And check out the podcast website for maps, images, sources, and more at granddukesofthewest.com. Once again, thank you for listening.